The desert didn't know mercy. It pressed its heat into the earth until the sand burned like embers, until the wind itself cut skin. And in the middle of that furnace, a man lay buried to his chest, chained to a steel stake, the world already forgetting he existed. But through the wall of sand came three shadows, strays with no master, no home, no reason to stop. One of them, a scarred German shepherd with eyes that carried the memory of war, didn't see a dying man. He saw a mission. And as the storm screamed, he planted his paws in the fire-red dunes and refused to move. If loyalty has a name where you live, tell us your city below, because this story will prove it still exists. Painted Mesa had always been a place the wind owned. On maps, it was a rust-colored scar between Dusford and the jagged ridges of New Mexico's Broken Spur Range. A place locals passed by with their windows rolled up and their radios turned high, as if ignoring it might keep its ghosts quiet. That morning, the sky over the mesa turned the color of burnt copper. At first, the wind whistled through the gullies like a distant warning. Then it rose to a scream, carrying the first knives of sand. The storm was coming fast. From a distance, 3 figures moved across the dunes. To an untrained eye, they looked like wild dogs caught in the storm, but their formation was too precise. One led from the front, tall and lean, ears upright despite the wind's fury. Duke, a 6-year-old sable German shepherd, had a coat, the color of stormlight, and scars that cut across his muzzle like old battle lines. Once he had been a military canine, trained to find the living under rubble or sand. Once he had a handler whose voice could cut through chaos. But that handler had not come back from their last mission. Duke had survived anyway. And survival had turned into something else. Leadership. To Duke's left ran Brutus, a mountain of muscle wrapped in the black and tan armor of a Rottweiler. His life had begun on a chain, guarding scrap in a junkyard where fists and boots taught him distrust. Only under Duke's silent command did he drop the instinct to fight first. To Duke's right, Rex, young, wiry, and restless, loped in and out of the pack's shadow. A Doberman built for speed and sharp turns, Rex had learned to survive on the streets, and his nervous energy now served as their early warning system. They had been pushing into the wind for hours when Duke stopped dead. His head lowered. He took in a breath, long and deliberate. Beneath the smell of rusted sage, coppery dust, and lightning-charged air, something else pulsed: sweat, blood, metal, and beneath it all, the slow, stubborn rhythm of human breath. Duke stepped forward, pressing his nose into the sand. Brutus crouched beside him. Rex circled, scanning the storm. Then Duke began to dig. Sand lashed his eyes and stung his scarred muzzle, but his paws worked faster, pulling away the dune grain by grain. Brutus joined in, each stroke of his massive forelegs clearing twice as much as the shepherd's. Rex stayed on the perimeter, pacing like a guard at a prison wall. 5 minutes in, Duke's claws scraped cloth, olive green, military grade. He nosed deeper, finding cold skin and the rigid edge of a shoulder. A man's face appeared in the swirling red haze, blistered, pale, eyes half shut under a mask of grit. His left wrist was chained to a rusted stake. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter, 34 years old, decorated Marine, now barely breathing in the middle of nowhere. He'd been tracking something, shipments that weren't supposed to be here, men unloading crates where no one patrolled. Someone had caught him, chained him, and buried him alive to disappear under the desert silence. The storm screamed. The sand piled higher, but the 3 dogs closed around him, Brutus blocking the worst of the wind, Rex holding the perimeter, Duke keeping his muzzle close to Carter's face, brushing sand from his mouth with careful teeth. They didn't know him. He wasn't their pack. But they weren't leaving. Far to the west, beyond the boiling heart of the storm, Evan Walker's pickup crawled along the edge of Painted Mesa. He came here most mornings, checking the old solar relay towers abandoned by some long-forgotten energy company. Routine kept his mind from wandering too far into the past, into the firefights, the empty bunks, the names carved into memory that war had taken from him. Today, though, routine fractured dot, he spotted the tracks first, 3 sets of canine. Prints, sharp and purposeful, cutting across the sand toward the storm's core. They weren't meandering like wild scavengers. These prints were deliberate, almost military in spacing. Evan killed the engine, stepped out, and crouched low. Who the hell lets dogs loose in this mess? The air already tasted of grit. Visibility was nearly gone. The storm's edge was a wall of red haze swallowing the horizon. But something in those prints tugged at him, the way they stayed. Tight, the pace unbroken. He popped the passenger door, grabbed a green duffel from the seat, and slung it over his shoulder. Inside, canteen, collapsible shovel, flare kit, a compact crowbar. Tools he kept out of habit more than hope. And then he followed the tracks into the wind. The deeper he went, the more the air turned into a living thing, abrasive, relentless. He caught sight of movement ahead. A tall shape crouched low, braced against the gale. Not a man, a dog. The shepherd's coat was dusted crimson from the storm, his head bent toward a mound of sand. Beside him, a Rottweiler dug like a machine, throwing dirt aside in heavy, measured bursts. A Doberman ghosted the edges of the scene, pausing to sniff the wind before darting off again. Evan's stomach dropped. In the center of their frantic work, a man's face emerged from the sand, sun-scorched, lips cracked, eyes barely open. His left wrist was shackled to a rusted stake. Whoever left him here meant for the desert to finish the job. Evan didn't waste a second. He dropped to his knees, shovel biting into the compacted sand. The dogs didn't challenge him. They simply shifted, making room. The shepherd stayed inches from the man's face, brushing grit away every time a gust tried to choke him. It was protocol, Evan realized. This wasn't random instinct. This was a dog who had worked beside humans, a dog who had learned what it meant to keep someone alive in the middle of hell. The chain was thick, looped tight around the Marine's wrist. Evan dug until the stake revealed itself, pitted and rusted, likely scavenged from construction scrap. He wedged the crowbar under it, put his weight into the leverage, and with a groan of metal, the stake came free. The shepherd's ears flicked, but his eyes never left the Marine's face. The Rottweiler rumbled deep in his chest, scanning the ridge beyond the storm. The Doberman froze mid-step, nose pointing towards something unseen in the haze. Evan followed their gaze. For a split second, 2 human silhouettes flickered on the ridge, tall still, watching. Then they were gone. He glanced down at the shepherd. You saw them too, didn't you? The dog's low growl was answer enough. Evan wrapped the Marine in a thermal blanket, slid one arm under his shoulders, the other under his knees, and lifted. The man groaned but didn't resist. Behind them, the dogs moved like an escort detail, the shepherd in front, the Rottweiler flanking left, the Doberman taking up the rear. The wind's scream dulled to a low whisper as they pushed toward the fading light, the desert silence returning. Evan didn't know the whole story yet. But one thing was certain, these dogs weren't strays. They were soldiers. By the time Evan reached his truck, the storm had passed, leaving Painted Mesa in a hush so deep it felt unnatural. The air was heavy, as though the desert was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through the dusty haze, painting long, thin shadows across the ridges. Evan set the Marine gently into the back seat, tucking the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The man's skin was pale beneath the grime, his breathing shallow but steady. His eyes opened briefly, cloudy, searching, before drifting shut again. Near the truck, the dogs had not relaxed. Duke stood tall and still, ears pricked forward, scanning the horizon with the focus of a sniper. Brutus sat broad and unyielding, his head swiveling slowly, nostrils flaring. Rex moved in short bursts, his wiry frame twitching with restless energy. Evan was about to climb into the driver's seat when something in the sand caught his eye, two parallel grooves cutting through the surface. He crouched, brushing the grit aside until the pattern was unmistakable. Tire tracks. Heavy duty, wide set, the kind you'd see on a desert transport truck. They started no more than 30 feet from where the Marine had been buried, arcing south toward a jagged drop-off, known locally as Dry Cut Hollow. Whoever left Carter here hadn't walked away, they'd driven. And recently, Evan pulled out his battered phone and snapped a series of photos. GPS tagging would have to wait until he had a signal, but he wasn't leaving this evidence to the wind. "Got you," he muttered. A low cough from the truck pulled his attention back. The Marine, Carter, was awake now, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Water." Evan grabbed the canteen, eased the cap open, and held it to his lips. Carter swallowed in slow, trembling gulps, every movement effortful. His eyes found the shepherd, who had stepped closer to the door, his amber gaze locked on the injured man. "That one," Carter whispered. "Duke?" Evan raised an eyebrow. "You know him?" "No," Carter said, breath hitching. "But I saw him at the camp." "What camp?" Evan pressed. Carter closed his eyes for a moment, as if dragging the memory out from a deep, raw place. Old military site. Concrete bunkers. Broken fencing. Southwest of here. They kept me there for 2 days before moving me. He coughed hard, gripping the blanket, then buried me in the mesa. Duke growled low, his head turning toward the southwest, exactly the direction Carter had described. Brutus stood and joined him, muscles tense. Rex gave a sharp bark, trotting in a tight circle before stopping to face the same horizon. Evan felt it too, the shift in the air, the unspoken signal. Something about this wasn't finished. Then, without warning, Duke bolted. Brutus and Rex flanked him immediately, moving as one. The three silhouettes cut a sharp line toward the ravine, sand spraying under their paws. Evan swore under his breath, dropped into the driver's seat, and fired the engine. "Guess we're doing this," he muttered, gunning the truck to follow. Desert unfolded in a blur. Ridges, dips, shattered fence posts, half buried in dunes. Paw prints appeared every few yards, sharp and fresh. The dogs weren't just running. They were leading. 15 minutes later, the truck crested a rise, and the view below tightened something in Evan's chest. Concrete walls, sagging barbed wire, watchtowers collapsed like broken bones. The skeleton of an old military compound lay cradled in the basin of the ravine, its rusted heart waiting. Duke stood at the edge of the entrance, tail stiff, body still. Brutus prowled near an overturned drum. Rex darted halfway down the slope, barking into the wind. Evan pulled into a low dip, killed the engine, and scanned the compound. No movement. No sound. Just the desert's quiet, the kind that always came before trouble. Evan kept the truck low in the ravine's shadow, letting the engine tick into silence. Beside him, Liam Carter shifted in the seat, every movement stiff with pain. His eyes, though rimmed with exhaustion, locked on the compound below. "That's it," he murmured. "That's where they kept me." Evan studied the terrain. 4 shipping containers formed a half circle at the compound center, their once blue paint bleached to bone white. Barbed wire coiled along the outer fence like a dead snake, rusted and sagging. The watchtowers were nothing more than skeletal frames. It looked abandoned, but it didn't feel that way. He glanced toward the slope. Duke was already halfway down, his movements slow and deliberate. Brutus lumbered behind him, scanning with a soldier's paranoia, while Rex zigzagged ahead, nose pressed to the ground, darting toward shadows, and then back to the pack. "You stay here," Evan told Carter. Grabbing his flashlight and camera from the glove box, Carter didn't argue. His body wouldn't allow him to. Evan moved down the slope, Duke falling in step beside him, as if they'd done this together for years. The shepherd didn't bark, didn't break focus, just moved like a sentinel. Brutus flanked Evan's left, a solid wall of muscle, while Rex disappeared around the nearest container, his nails clicking on the hard-packed dirt. The first container door hung crooked on corroded hinges. Evan reached for the handle, but Carter's voice stopped him. "Let Brutus do it." Evan stepped back. Brutus lowered his massive head, backed up a few feet, then lunged forward with a shoulder slam that made the door shriek open. A stale wave of rust, gasoline, and something darker rolled out. Inside, the walls were lined with crude iron loops welded into place. Chains dangled from them, their ends scuffed and scarred. A rotted mattress lay curled in the corner like an old husk. The dirt floor was etched with scratches, some from boots, others from nails or fingertips clawing for freedom. Carter's voice was tight. "I was chained right there." He pointed to a loop near the far wall. "But I wasn't the only one." Evan's flashlight beam swept the shadows, catching dried stains near the door, the kind the desert couldn't quite swallow. He crouched and began snapping photos, the chains, the floor, every mark that told the truth. Behind him, Duke padded toward the back corner, nose low. He began to dig, each paw strike methodical. A minute later, his claws hit something solid. Evan knelt beside him and unearthed a small canvas satchel bound with decayed twine. Inside, a folded American flag patch worn to stiffness. A tarnished dog tag, Keller & J, USMC. One spent bullet casing, a coin, no wallet, no notes. Just enough to say I was here. I didn't make it out. Carter stared at the name. "I don't know him," he said, voice low. "But he's one of us." Evan felt the air grow heavier. "How long ago?" He murmured. Only the wind answered, slipping through the barbed wire with a sound like whispers. They moved to the next containers. One was empty. Another was stacked with rusted barrels and broken tools. But the last, a newer unit, with fresh paint, was locked tight with a padlock that gleamed under the sun. Evan took a step back, eyes narrowing. "We're not opening that until we have backup." "You think they're still using this place?" Carter asked. Evan didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the ground near the gate. Fresh tire tracks, wide, heavy, barely touched by wind. Someone had been here recently. Maybe still was. The light had shifted, softening into the long shadows of late afternoon. The wind was dying, leaving only the faint creak of barbed wire and the slow tick of cooling metal on the rusted containers. Evan was halfway back to the truck when Duke froze. The shepherd's head lifted, ears tight, nose angled toward the canyon mouth. A low, rolling growl swelled in his chest. Brutus emerged from between two containers, hackles raised. Rex stopped his restless circling, tail rigid, eyes locked on the same point as Duke. Evan followed their line of sight and heard it before he saw it, gravel crunching. A mechanical hum. Then two pairs of headlights blinked through the dust. Two black pickups rolled into view, their matte paint dull under the sinking sun. No plates, no markings. Engines idling low, like predators breathing before a strike. They pulled up less than 40 feet away, blocking the only clear exit from the canyon. 4 men stepped out. All wore sun-bleached khaki fatigues and mirrored sunglasses, desert gear, but not military issue. The tallest carried himself with the slow, confident gait of someone who knew violence and trusted it to speak for him. A hawk's nose cut sharp across his face. His dark hair was pulled into a tight ponytail. On his right arm, a faded tattoo, a playing card, and a bullet. "Well, look what the sand blew in," he said, his voice smooth but coiled. His gaze slid past Evan and landed on Carter, who sat in the truck, upright but pale. A slow smile spread across the man's face. "Didn't expect to see you breathing, Marine." Carter's fingers tightened on the edge of the seat. "Jake Strickland," he rasped. "One of them." "Thought we buried you deep enough," Jake replied. "Guess we'll have to fix that." Evan moved a step forward, placing himself between the truck and the approaching men. His hands itched toward the crowbar in the back seat, but he didn't break eye contact. The air shifted again, not from the wind, but from the dogs. Brutus's growl deepened into a chest-rattling rumble. Rex bared his teeth, every muscle in his frame pulled taut. But it was Duke who stepped forward, slow and deliberate, planting himself squarely in front of Evan, his head lowered, tail straight, eyes locked on Jake with a look that didn't waver. Jake's smirk twitched. "Nice mutt." Duke moved like a switch had flipped, a blur of fur and muscle. His jaws locked onto Jake's forearm, the one gripping a pistol. The gun fired once into the air before spinning out of his hand. Chaos erupted. Brutus charged the second man, his massive weight slamming into him like a battering ram. The man went down hard, air blasted from his lungs. Rex launched off the truck bed, clamping his jaws on a third man's thigh and dragging him sideways before he could get his rifle into position. The fourth man swung his rifle up, too slow. Evan was already diving for the dropped pistol. Jake screamed as Duke twisted his arm, forcing him down to one knee. Evan came up with the weapon, aimed low, and fired into the dirt at the fourth man's boots. "Step back!" He barked. The man froze, hands half raised. Jake tried to lunge again, but Duke released him with a shove and a snarl, blood streaking his muzzle. The shepherd didn't retreat. He stood his ground, daring anyone to come closer. "Get in!" Evan shouted over his shoulder. Carter slid lower in the seat as Evan rounded the hood and slammed into the driver's seat. Brutus broke off from his opponent with a final shove. Rex darted away, still snarling. All three dogs leapt into the truck bed as Evan floored the accelerator. The pickup roared forward, squeezing through the narrow gap between the black trucks. Metal screamed as the side mirror snapped off against one of the vehicles. "A man dove!" "Clear!" Another shouted something lost to the wind. Then they were through, tires chewing up the open desert, the horizon bleeding gold ahead dot in the rear view. The black pickup stayed still. But the men, they'd be back. The truck tore across the open flats, its tires spitting up sheets of dust that hung in the air like a trailing storm. Evan kept his eyes on the horizon, pushing the engine harder than he should, the wheel tight in his grip. Every so often he glanced in the rear view. No black pickups, no rising dust trails. Just the still burning desert behind them, dot in the passenger seat. Carter sat wrapped in the olive-green thermal blanket, his face pale under the bruises. His jaw was tight, but his breathing had evened out. He kept one hand pressed to his side, where a deep bruise had blossomed dark purple. "You all right?" Evan asked without looking away from the road. "I've been worse," Carter said, voice raw, "but not by much." He shifted his gaze toward the back of the truck. "They still with us?" Evan checked the mirror again. The dogs were there. 3 living silhouettes against the gold of the setting sun. Brutus stood braced at the tailgate, scanning their back trail with unwavering focus. Rex paced in short, tight circles, his eyes flicking to the horizon every few seconds. Duke sat in the center, still as stone, ears forward, his gaze fixed not behind them, but ahead, as if he already knew where they needed to go. "They're not just staying," Evan said quietly. "They're guarding you." Carter gave a faint, tired smile. "They saved me before you ever got there." His voice hardened. "And they know who we're dealing with." Evan didn't need to ask. The way Duke had reacted to those men, the way all three had moved in perfect unison, told him this wasn't their first time facing danger like that. By the time the low adobe buildings of Dustford came into view, the sun had dropped far enough to paint the sky in ribbons of crimson and violet. Evan pulled up to the town's squat hospital, a place more accustomed to rattlesnake bites and broken fence posts than combat injuries. Nurse June. Morales met them at the doors. Tall, wiry, with dark hair pulled back in a braid streaked with silver, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had patched up soldiers in worse conditions. "Get him inside," she ordered, her voice sharp but warm beneath it. She guided Carter into a small exam room, cutting away the remains of his tattered uniform to get at the bruises and lacerations. Evan stayed in the hallway, leaning against the wall. Through the open door, he could hear the soft murmur of June's voice and the rustle of bandages. Outside, the dogs waited in the shade of the truck. Duke sat facing the street, scanning every passing shadow. Brutus stretched out with a heavy sigh. Rex trotted a restless circuit between the steps and the tailgate. Half an hour later, Evan stepped outside to them. He crouched, meeting Duke's amber eyes. "You're not done, are you?" The shepherd didn't blink, didn't break his gaze. Somewhere deep in those eyes was the same resolve Evan had seen in soldiers before a second push into enemy territory. Inside, Carter was already talking to the sheriff's deputy, giving what details he could. Old military site, concrete bunkers, heavy tire tracks, men who worked in teams and didn't leave witnesses. Evan handed over his own photos, the chains, the dog tag, the newer padlocked container, and the GPS coordinates he'd tagged. Before leaving. By nightfall, word was moving fast. This wasn't just an assault, this was a network. And somewhere out there, that newer container might still be holding something or someone alive. Evan looked once more toward the dogs. In the truck bed, Duke's gaze was fixed on the darkening horizon. Muscles coiled like he was waiting for the word to move again. And Evan had the uneasy feeling that when they went back, it wouldn't be to run. The next morning broke sharp and cold, the kind of desert dawn that painted everything in pale gold and long shadows. Evan was at the sheriff's office before sunrise, his truck idling outside while Duke, Brutus, and Rex stood in the bed, alert and restless. Inside, Deputy Carla Boone was already working the phones. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and dressed in sun-faded denim, she didn't bother with small talk. "Your photos match reports we've been sitting on for months," she told Evan. "Smugglers, ex-military muscle for hire. We never had eyes on their base until now. State's sending a TAC team by noon." Evan nodded. "If you want my advice, you don't wait that long." Carla studied him for a beat, then glanced past him to the window where Duke's silhouette cut against the rising sun. "That shepherd, he's not just tagging along, is he?" Evan allowed himself the faintest smile. "He knows the terrain better than anyone." By mid-morning, a convoy was forming outside town. 2 sheriff's trucks, 3 state SUVs, and Evan's old pickup bringing up the rear. Carter had insisted on coming, crutches under his arms, stubbornness in his eyes. He climbed into the passenger seat without asking. "I'm not sitting this out," he said. The dogs rode in the back again. Duke standing tall at the center, Brutus to his left, Rex weaving between them. As the vehicles pushed into the mesa, the shepherd's eyes never left the horizon. When they reached the ravine's lip, the compound lay below, exactly as before, silent, sun-bleached, waiting. Only now, Evan could see faint scuffs in the dirt near the gate. Fresh. Someone had been here since they'd left. Carla motioned her team forward, splitting into 2 groups to cover both flanks. Evan moved with the lead unit, Duke just ahead, his paws silent on the hard-packed ground. Brutus followed like a moving wall, and Rex darted into shadows, doubling back with quick snaps of his head as if to say clear. At the first container, Duke stopped cold. His tail went rigid. A single sharp bark cut the air, a signal, not a warning. Carla's second unit circled to the rear. Evan followed Duke's line toward the newer container, the one with the untouched lock. Only now the lock was gone, hanging split in 2 on the ground. Inside, the air was cooler, shadowed. 2 battered folding chairs sat against the far wall, a metal bucket in the corner. And in the center, A woman in her late 20s sat chained at the wrist, her dark hair matted, her eyes squinting against the sudden light. She flinched as the door swung wider until Duke stepped forward. His head was low, ears soft now, tail held steady. The change in him was immediate, his whole body shifting from soldier to guardian. The woman's gaze locked on him, and something in her shoulders eased. "We've got one alive," Evan called over his shoulder. Carla was already moving in, bolt cutters snapping the chain. Outside, a shout went up from the far end of the compound, movement in the rocks above the ravine. Two men broke from cover, rifles in hand. Shots cracked, shipping rust from the containers. The dogs moved before the deputies could react. Duke angled toward the left flank, cutting off one shooter's descent. Brutus barreled toward the second. Teeth bared, forcing him into the open, where a deputy dropped him with a tackle. Rex zigzagged between them, keeping the men off balance, snapping at their boots until they stumbled. Within minutes, the gunfire had stopped. The two attackers were cuffed, the woman was in the care of medics, and the compound was finally truly under law's control. But even as the deputy started cataloging the site, Duke kept looking past the fence, his gaze sweeping the open desert beyond. Evan knew that look. The mission wasn't over. By sunset, the compound was empty of danger. Deputies loaded evidence into trucks, chains, crates, a stack of unmarked weapons, and the dog tag Evan had found in the dirt. Jake Strickland and the surviving mercenaries were cuffed and silent in the back of the sheriff's SUVs, their mirrored sunglasses gone, their confidence stripped away. The rescued woman sat wrapped in a blanket near the medic's van, her eyes following Duke whenever he passed. She'd told Carla she'd been taken from a roadside rest stop 2 states over, waking to find herself in that container. She didn't remember every detail. Trauma had blurred the edges, but she remembered the sound of barking that morning. Sharp and close, before the deputies found her. Evan stood with Carter at the tailgate of his truck, watching the last of the evidence crews pull out. Carter's crutches sank slightly into the sand, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze was fixed on the 3 dogs in the fading light. "They're not strays," he said quietly. "No," Evan replied. "They've just been waiting for the right mission." When the convoy finally rolled back toward Dusford, Evan didn't head straight into town. Instead, he turned north, toward his ranch, 10 miles of quiet pasture and an old house that had been empty far too long. The dogs rode in the bed, tails high, heads up in the wind. That night, papers were signed, vaccinations recorded, names etched into simple brass tags: Duke, Brutus, Rex. In the span of a few hours, they had gone from shadows on the mesa to something far more permanent. Life settled into a rhythm quickly. Brutus claimed the porch, stretching out like a living fortress. Rex took to the barn roof, somehow managing to perch there every evening, scanning the yard with bright, twitching eyes. Duke moved like a sentinel, making slow, deliberate circuits of the fence line at dawn and dusk. People started visiting the ranch, neighbors bringing food, kids wanting to see the desert heroes. Evan, a man who once kept his gates shut to the world, found himself leaning on the fence in the evenings, Duke at his side, watching the sun dip below the mesa. A week later, Carter came by. He moved carefully with his cane, but his eyes were steady now, his voice strong. The dogs greeted him like an old comrade. Duke stepped forward, sniffed once, then rested his chin on Carter's knee. "You saved my life," Carter murmured. Duke didn't blink. His gaze stayed on the horizon, as if already thinking of the next call. The following morning, painted mesa flared crimson under the first strike of sunlight. The wind carried the scent of dry mesquite and cactus bloom. Brutus stretched and yawned. Rex trotted along the fence line, chasing a shadow. And Duke climbed the highest ridge on the property, standing tall against the sky. From up there, he could see everything: the empty roads, the distant mountains, the faint trails that cut, across the land. His ears shifted with each sound, his tail steady, his stance unshakable. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends them with paws, scars, and a purpose. And in the stillness of Painted Mesa, Duke stood watch, for the lost, for the broken, for anyone in need of a second chance.